G'day, it's Justin Hogg here from RightSource, talking governance, not-for-profits, anything and everything. So today we wanted to talk about the board structuring and I suppose how you look to bring executives in on the board meeting. So board meetings generally consist of obviously directors and by default the CEO, because there is that communication flow to the CEO to operations. But often there's a question about whether you bring other members of the executive or management team into the meeting. Now this can be your CFO, your COO, your CIO, it could be a general manager, or for smaller not-for-profits, it can sometimes be some of your operational staff who are in charge of key areas of delivering your services. When do you bring these and what's the positives and negatives? That's what I want to talk through today. So probably the first, in terms of the positives that you get in having more of an audience at that board meeting, is the first thing is it helps confirm when the CEO comes back to the operational team, it helps confirm with the operational team what was discussed, and it sort of gives that validation. Not that you need it, but it helps. And also it can allow the CEO to have someone else who's at the meeting say, well, this is what I took from it, this is and making sure that that interpretation is correct. So that's useful. It also can allow, I suppose, or help prevent a CEO that doesn't come back and necessarily give the same message the board was giving. That's, obviously you don't want to be in that situation, but obviously having two people from the executive at the meeting does help provide that counterbalance. The other aspect that it does in having your executive there is it allows the board to get a feel for how operations are going. So obviously they have to rely very heavily on the CEO and what they're reporting back in terms of how operations are progressing, but sometimes to get a feel of the culture of the organization, to get a feel of specific issues that might have come up, having the relevant operational people at the meeting can allow the board to get a better handle on that or confidence in terms of how they're interpreting the way operations are proceeding, which is an important function of the board. Next, sort of additional to those points, having executive come along to the meeting, especially if it's just a 2IC or you've got a succession plan for the CEO, that allows those executives to get experience in dealing with the board and understanding how the conversation flows, what information they're looking for, and allows those relationships to develop so that if and when the CEO does move on, there is an easier step through to, I suppose, that succession plan, or even if it's an unexpected leave of the CEO, the board already has others they can communicate with readily to keep operations going. And then lastly, in terms of positives, it can just help take a load off the CEO. If the CEO is having to report on everything, which they are responsible for, so there's nothing wrong with that, but having others in their team who might be able to come in and present on a specific topic where the board may in fact have wanting to ask more detailed questions, having those executives there can just help the CEO not have to do everything and can help delegate that work to members of the team who are equally capable of doing that work. So they're probably some of the initial positives in terms of having your executive at the board meeting. Now, in terms of things you need to watch out for, the negatives of having executive at the board meeting. The first thing is, if you have too many people, it's like any meeting. As the number of people who attend grow, the conversations can become longer. There can be more people wanting to put in opinions, so it can just extend the length of the meeting and it can become ineffective. So being selective in terms of the executive you bring and making sure that it doesn't expand the meeting numbers too big is something to be aware of. The other thing that's really important, and I suppose in the application of this, is that the board needs time to be able to talk about when things don't go well. And this is just a normal part of accountability. Not everything goes right all the time, so there needs to be able to be a conversation in terms of feedback or input that the board gives the CEO in terms of their performance. Now, sometimes, or quite often I would say, having the executive there whilst that type of feedback's being given to the CEO can be, one, it can make the directors reluctant to give full and frank feedback, which is important to be able to give. But two, if full and frank feedback is given and it's not necessarily positive, it can diminish the CEO's authority with the executive who are seeing that. So that's some positives and negatives in terms of having an executive at the board meeting. So how do you look at doing this practically? So the tips in terms that I would look at practically for doing this is make sure you structure the board meeting in a way that it flows, and you have a time where a section of the meeting where you have the CEO and the relevant executives there. You have a part of the meeting where it's the CEO and the board, so that if there's any feedback or specific discussions that need to happen, that can happen there. And lastly, I'd always recommend having what's called an in-camera session, where it's a board only who are participating in the meeting. That allows both, and you can do that at the front or the back of the meeting, or both. It allows for the directors to give that feedback in terms of how the meeting's going, clarify any points in the agenda, and have a discussion in terms of making sure that they're clear on where the board is and the direction the board wants to head, so that when they're providing that message to the CEO and the executive, they're providing a relatively clear direction. I mean, they can disagree and you can discuss points, but at least understanding the direction that the board as a whole is wanting to head at that meeting. Back with when executive are attending the meeting, the other way you can organize it is a couple ways actually, is you can have like a rotating process, so that at different board meetings through the year, different executive attend. So that way they get a taste of the board meeting, helps develop relationships, but they're not there all the time. So it doesn't weigh down that board meeting and doesn't turn it into an operational meeting. The other way is to have the executive turn up for just the specific items of discussion that's relevant for them. Now that's, obviously that works well if you're having a meeting on site or a head office where those executives are. It also tends to work well now where you're doing a lot of teleconference or Zoom or Teams calls now, and you can actually bring people in for that point in that meeting quite easily, and allows them to participate, be there for the relevant discussion, but then allow them to pull out of the meeting so that the board can discuss any of those relevant issues just with the CEO or with the pertinent executive. So it allows you to control the audience that's at the board meeting a bit better. And all this work, I suppose, one of the big impacts it has is on culture. So you need to be thinking about, from a board perspective, what's the impact this is having on culture? Do you want people to feel empowered? Do you want people to have direction? Or are they getting enough of that from the CEO? It's actually quite something that needs to be deliberate and thought about in terms of how you're organizing the board meetings and that flow of communication. So that's it for today's video in terms of having an executive at your board and some thoughts around that. And if you've got any other questions, feel free to put them in the comments below or reach out to me on LinkedIn. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this video, definitely feel free to subscribe and check out our YouTube channel, because we've got heaps of other videos regarding not-for-profits, boards, and just governance generally. Otherwise, thanks for your time today. It's Justin Hogg from RightSource.